To introduce Emmanuel Decat, Professor Emmanuel Decat, now at the University of Utrecht, but for a long while at IDS. And I want to make 3 points by way of introduction. First, we all ought to be grateful for Emmanuel, because while he was at IDS for 27 years, he fulfilled virtually every role in the Institute: Director of Research, Acting Director, Deputy Director, goodness knows what. But when the Institute was challenged and nearly under real threat, I think, early on, he was sent by Dudley Sive to negotiate with DFID. And we survived. That alone is enough for a round of applause. Second, there are already places in the IDS where you can see his handiwork. The fact that the IDS has a spiral staircase, I think one of Emmanuel's creations, and so forth. And there are others. But finally, and for this evening's purposes, I'm extremely grateful that Emmanuel has agreed to come and give a Sussex Development lecture on religion and development. It's one of the underexplored topics in development. Emmanuel first wrote about it in the late 1960s when he wrote a book called Catholic Radicals in Brazil. And then 2 years ago, I think it was, he's written his latest book, which is Assertive Religion, and that you can get on the on websites. So there is a copy also in IDS. So in a career that has looked at all sorts of dimensions of social policy, tourism, goodness knows what, Emmanuel has come back now to a topic that he was well ahead of the game in late 1960s, and I regret to say is still somewhat ahead of the game, because the issue ought to have more attention than it does. We're going to have this recorded, so if people haven't made it tonight, please tell them they can look on the IDS website and get it. And dear EDK, as I've always called you, Emmanuel Decat, Professor Emmanuel Decat, over to you.
Well, after such an introduction, everything must be a letdown. So let me try not to make it too much of a letdown. Thank you so much, Richard. I think that was slightly over the top, but never mind. Well, as Richard has said, my topic today is religious fundamentalism and its effect on development. So I do need to begin with a few words about my qualifications, or rather the lack of them, to speak in 2014 on issues of development. After I left IDS in 1996, my work at the Department of Anthropology in Utrecht has taken me from development back, as Richard has already said, to the topic that interested me at the beginning of my academic career, namely religion and society. When I started work in that field, some 50 years ago, it was radical, progressive Catholic priests in Latin America who held the attention. When I returned to the topic in the late 90s, it was fundamentalists of all hues that were in the public eye. So I suppose I'm reasonably knowledgeable on fundamentalism. But anyway, I'm honoured to have been asked to give this Sussex Development lecture, and I must say that I've discussed a broadly similar topic right here some 8 years ago, though I shall try not to repeat myself more than at the margins. Well, since that time, 8 years ago, the importance of religion in people's lives and its significance as part of their identity has continued to increase considerably. There have been different reasons for this in different places and in different contexts, and I shall touch on some of them as we go along. Now, this increase in the importance of religion has been due to what we might call push factors and pull factors. And let's begin with some of the factors pushing people towards religion, especially in developing countries. When development doesn't happen, or when, as is so often the case, economic changes only benefit a small part of the population. By the way, recently, growing inequalities have become a major issue almost anywhere in the world, including in the North. Think of the widespread interest in Piketty. People's hopes for better living standards are frustrated. When that happens, the people who say that God told them why this is so. Fundamentalists, Sikhs in the Punjab have the ear of peasants hit by the unequal distribution of the benefits of the Green Revolution. While the Islamic revolution in Iran has been seen as a reaction to the modernization and secularization promoted by the Shah, which again led to growing inequality and increasing corruption under a centralized and ultimately arbitrary regime. Boko Haram, more about them later, has been widely portrayed as just such a reaction to the lack of development, and also incidentally to an excess of brutality and violence on the part of the state. Counterpart. If such exclusion is diminished by proper developmental measures, perhaps especially the implementation of policies that reduce overall socio-economic inequality, it becomes less likely that people will turn to those who promise salvation by religious redemption. Now, when development does happen, it also causes disruption, though of a different kind. Development implies modernization. Modernization changes the way people see themselves. That's fine for those who have been educated in the European mold. That small minority usually hold the reins of government and who make the so-called modernizing laws. Laws, however, that affect the lives of all. But most people in those societies continue to live by traditional norms, handed down from generation to generation within the family and the local community. Meanwhile, the modernized public institutions implicitly assume that those people, the traditional people, too, have changed. And that heightens their sense of disorientation. So what happens? They look for support, possibly from religious organizations, especially if these offer both strong sense of community and strong individual support. And that is precisely what fundamentalists tend to offer. And it explains, at least in part, the unparalleled rise of the Pentecostal churches in Latin America and in Africa. But the same disorienting factors exist in contemporary Arab and Islamic societies. And as Ayubi has said, and I quote here, a high degree of dissonance and conflict between the traditional values to which the individual has been socialized and the modern values by which economic, administrative and legal organizations are supposed to be governed, especially in the urban, semi-industrialized and rather impersonal environment of the city. So much for what I've called the push factors. But there have also been what you might call pull factors. Most significant among these can be the increased presence of religious activists who are often fundamentalists. That has been quite important for Islam, whose fundamentalists have had a great impact throughout the world, but also in the case of American-based Pentecostal Protestants, whose phenomenally expanded proselytizing activities have had interesting and contradictory effects on development. And I'll talk more about this in a moment. Now, as the issue before us is development and fundamentalism, and not development and religion, I'd better say a few words about the main similarities and differences. All religions rest on belief, and ultimately on belief in divine revelation. Modern or liberal versions of religion usually accept that no one religion contains the complete truth. Therefore, they don't try to impose their view on others. More traditional approaches have less sympathy for religious pluralism. And most extreme in this respect are fundamentalist religious views. So, very briefly, what are the central points of fundamentalism? Let me just raise the main issues which are particularly relevant to our concerns tonight. Fundamentalists see religious authority as holistic and absolute. They accept neither criticism nor reinterpretation. And they see the do's and don'ts derived from their sacred writings as unalterable truth, valid for all times. They're intolerant of alternative views, including those of different fundamentalist groups within the same religion. Think of the Sunnis versus the Shia Muslims. And each group sees its own teaching as absolutely correct. And most significantly, perhaps, fundamentalists want to dominate the state and have their religious views incorporated into the structure of society through legal enforcement. Now, while fundamentalists are anxious to convince others of the correctness of their viewpoint, few of them are willing to impose their views by violent means, or to die, let alone kill for their beliefs. Yes, there are violent fundamentalists, and these have particularly negative effects on development. But please note that it cannot be said that fundamentalists in general are extremists. In the case of Islam, all believing Muslims, and not only the fundamentalists among them, accept that Islam is the final religion, and the only true faith. A faith that Muslims have a duty to spread. The Quran and the Sunnah, the body of traditional customs attributed to Muhammad, are thought to contain all the essential truths required by all humanity until the end of time. That position can lead to significant clashes with the contemporary prescriptions of development practice. Finally, for now, Fundamentalists reject modernity, the secular and often explicitly non-religious values of which are alien to people from traditional backgrounds, and values that can leave those people deeply perplexed. So they are likely to listen to the views of those who claim to have answers to those perplexities, and that is precisely what fundamentalists offer. Fundamentalists offer clarity and certainty for perplexed people. Follow us, and we know that God will solve your problems. Now, let's have a closer look at development and consider the relevance to it of some of these characteristics of fundamentalism. It's a long time ago that we thought we could characterize development by a simple measure such as GNP per capita. For decades now, we've got a fuller picture by approaching development, for example, via the Human Development Index. And that approach has been refined considerably over time. So, as a first line of attack, I tried to use some of the figures in many of the tables now found in the Human Development Report. But unfortunately, that didn't take me very far. That is mainly because there are no data on religiosity, so that any comparisons between more and less religious societies are merely based on broadly plausible assumptions. Let me just give you one example. Secular female education is for some fundamentalisms deeply taboo. Notably, of course, for Jewish and Muslim fundamentalists. I won't talk about the Jews because they aren't found in significant numbers in less developed countries. But if you consider the proportion of women who have at least a secondary education, there are some startling figures in the latest Human Development Report, which gives an average for the 5 years of 2006 to 2011. So, proportion of women who have at least a secondary education. For Europe and Central Asia, the rounded figure, I round these figures up, okay, is 81%. It won't surprise you that for sub-Saharan Africa, the figure of the proportion of women who have at least secondary education drops to 24%. And that can't be explained by religion or culture, obviously. But in the Arab states, many of them rich by any measure, that proportion is overall no higher than 32%. Proportion of women who have at least secondary education. Some of the smaller countries in the Arab region, Brunei, Qatar, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, do have percentages that fluctuate around 70%. And these are certainly countries where Islam is of central cultural and political importance. So, some caution is required. Nevertheless, Saudi Arabia, without any question, a country where Islamic fundamentalists rule, so to speak, and which has no shortage of resources, comes no higher than 50% on this measure. And it is difficult not to assume that here religion is a central factor in holding down this important indicator for development. But such nationwide data are of very limited use. Yes, there are a few countries which we can describe and characterize as fundamentalist, but indeed there are only a few. Elsewhere, if we have disaggregated statistics and knowledge of where the fundamentalists are concentrated, because they do tend to cluster together, it might be possible to compare development indicators for fundamentalist, so to speak, and non-fundamentalist areas. But even then, we would need much caution in interpreting the figures. If any of you, at the end of this story, are convinced that the issues are worth following up in a specific place, you will have to do original research. So I'll just bring out some of the probable effects of fundamentalism on issues likely to affect the potential for human development. For two religions. I shall confine myself to Christianity and Islam, because as I've already said, Judaism is not really relevant to development issues, while my knowledge of Hinduism and Buddhism doesn't go much beyond that of the average newspaper reader. And I will rely on my book, A Search of Religion, for at least some of this discussion. Let me start with Christianity. And first a few words about Roman Catholicism and the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church has a long history of involvement with development issues. On the whole, very positive, as long as you disregard anything to do with sexuality. And with Pope Francis's open dislike for pomposity and ostentation, inequality has re-emerged as a significant question. But as we shall be talking about developing fundamentalism, Roman Catholicism falls outside the purview of this discussion. Yes, it does harbor deeply conservative organizations such as Opus Dei, but its centralized nature of the Roman Catholic Church has prevented fundamentalist movements from taking root. Some of you may remember Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who died more than 20 years ago, and his Society of St. Pius XII, which opposed the adornamento of the Church, and that was the closest the Catholic Church ever came to having a fundamentalist movement. But Lefebvre and his movement were speedily denied a place within the Church by Pope John Paul II. So, while it emerged from the Catholic Church, we cannot really consider this to be a Catholic fundamentalist movement. Nor has any other taken root since then, as the centralized structure of the Catholic Church nips true fundamentalism in the bud. But fundamentalism does thrive among Protestants. In fact, it was among American Protestants that the term fundamentalist was first coined. It was those who were going back to the fundamentals of the faith. And I shall base my discussion about Protestant fundamentalism and development largely on the evangelical Pentecostals, a substantial proportion of whom can be regarded as fundamentalist. And over the last 50 years or so, their growth in developing countries has been phenomenal, mainly as a result of the crusading activities of North American missionary societies. This has been felt both in Africa and in Latin America. And though my discussion will focus largely on Latin America, in relation to the issues that interest us here, their impact on Africa has been comparable. Now exclusion has probably been the most significant factor in the rise of Pentecostal movements. At the end of his paper on Pentecostals in Chile, Sepulveda draws the conclusion that Pentecostalism should be located, as I quote, in the context of the struggle of the mestizo and indigenous underclasses, the Bajo Pueblo, to reassert their cultural identity and their religious self-determination. And similarly, Preston notes that in Mexico, where indigenous communities have long been dominated and exploited by mestizos, conversion to Protestantism was seen by these communities as a way to escape such domination, at least in the symbolic realm. This resulted in enormous hostility and even violence from their oppressors. The economically dominant conservative Catholic mestizos demanded from their underlings that they choose between their religion and getting support from the traditional clientelistic system. Preston, a quote. The opposition goes through social pressure, through ostracism and threats, to violent expulsion and even murder. More than 30,000 Indians have been expelled from their lands by the local caciques. Sometimes they are presented with a choice: renounce evangelical faith or sign a document that they are voluntarily abandoning their land and belongings. No other group in Mexico has suffered such prolonged persecution. Now, Pentecostals see poverty or being dominated as a punishment for sin. That means it's all your own fault, ultimately. And there is a remarkable parallel here with the doctrines of neoliberalism. For neoliberals too, individual effort explains social outcomes. Economic or social structure and processes are effectively ignored. From a developmental perspective, that is hardly a promising start. But there is a paradox in this relation with neoliberalism. Pentecostal movements have also been a reaction by the poor to the problems that neoliberalism has brought about. When the wider society values people for what they are worth, not for what they are, people seek out places where, as Gaskell puts it, meaningful and fulfilling social interaction can take place. And preeminent among these places are the family and those religious organizations that emphasize the individual. Now, has Pentecostal been beneficial to people? In many respects, it has had a beneficial effect on the personal lives of its adherents. Among Latino Pentecostals at least, interpersonal violence, drunkenness, and machismo have all receded. The position of women has improved, and Pentecostals usually have a greater sense of self-respect than others around them. These are important changes, and you would have thought relevant to development. By analogy with Max Weber's analysis of Calvinism, they should have improved their economic well-being because of their individual effort, thereby reducing their poverty and, in general, inequality. But no. As Gaskell has discovered, when he explicitly addressed this question, the contemporary Pentecostal belief system does not appear to produce such a Weberian effect. And others have reached very similar conclusions. As the emphasis is on freeing oneself from the clutches of Satan, poverty is his work. Pentecostalism leads neither to a clear set of economic aspirations nor to social mobility. Poor Pentecostals tend to remain poor. so, after conversion, Pentecostals do find a new sense of dignity, and refuse to accept poverty and wallow in self-pity. Their religion helped believers cope with chronic poverty. Even when they do not confront structural problems, it makes it easier for them to manage these, also through their participation in networks of state patronage. Now, I see that actually I'm taking more time than I thought I was going to, so I will have to run through some of these points a bit faster. By the way, the full text of this lecture, including footnotes and everything else, is on the IDS website. Am I right?
It will be.
It will be. So don't worry, you can read it all, even those things that I haven't talked about properly. Now, a few words only on the political outlook of Pentecostals. The picture is rather complex. To begin with, they are strongly respectful of the rule of law, and this may lead to oppose rulers who are not. But yes, they have often supported autocratic regimes, though the reasons for that have been varied. In the case of Guatemala, for example, the fact that General Efraín Ríos Montt, who took power in that country after a military coup in March 1982, had converted to Pentecostalism a few years earlier, is likely to have influenced poor Pentecostals to support him. But elsewhere, their deep hostility to Catholicism may have been more important, making them shun politicians with close links to the Catholic Church, such as Chile's Christian Democrats. These Christian Democrats in Chile strongly opposed the dictatorship of Pinochet, who was consequently supported by many Pentecostals. Now, I will jump over a few other issues now, and I want to turn to Islam, fundamentalism, and development. There were three reasons why Islamic fundamentalism is important for our theme. In the first place, because Islam is the second largest religion in the world after Christianity. Secondly, because in Islam the distinction between mainstream and fundamentalist is less clear than it is among most other religions. This is significant for a number of development issues. And in the third place, because the bulk of Muslims are in fact found in poor countries. Now, where do we find the main concentration of Muslims? Most breakdowns are based on the considerable amount of guesswork, as few countries publish religious statistics on religious affiliation. But overall, in a broad sense, we may say that there are some 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, around a quarter of the total world population, and the vast majority of those are found in developing countries. Details are found in the paper that you can look at. Whatever the precise total, the main areas and countries with substantial or predominant Islamic populations are clear. In Asia, they make up around a quarter of the total population, and they constitute just under 2/3 of all Muslims in the world. In the Middle East and North Africa, they make up around 90% of the total population, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, that proportion is close to 1/3. Now, I'll try to approach Islam and development through the issue of human rights. Islam's fundamentalist and mainstream varieties are closer together than is the case for other world religions. Mainly because for all believing Muslims, Islam is the one and only true faith. Yes, there is a Quranic injunction that there should be no compulsion in religion, but this clashes with other prescriptions about spreading the faith. A faith which is seen as containing all necessary guidelines for all time for living in the world. Islamic reactions to the underlying ideas, underlying human rights, which I shall use as a way to access issues of development, provide a good example of the meshing of mainstream and fundamentalist views. I won't go into the long history of development of the idea of human rights, but there have been Islamic objections to them right from the emergence of the idea soon after World War II. Most countries with Islamic majorities that were members of the United Nations in 1948 did sign the original Universal Declaration, though Saudi Arabia did abstain. But Islamic countries were never comfortable with parts of this declaration and its more detailed successors. And they were in the forefront of arguing that these constituted a Western imposition of its values on the rest of the world. It was argued that accepting some of the rights, especially those dealing with issues of authority, equality and gender, should be resisted in the name of cultural differences. Of course, all religious fundamentalists have reservations about human rights. Any group that believes that sometime in the past all rights and duties were laid down by God will not feel bound by such human artifacts as human rights conventions. But among Muslims, such reservations are found among the mainstream. A good example of the fuzzy demarcation between mainstream and fundamentalists there. From the early 1980s, these reservations led to the elaboration of a specifically Islamic approach to human rights, one in consonance with Islamic law, Sharia, and the Islamic fundamentalists played a major part in this development, though it was carried forward by presumably mainstream Islamic states. And this lead, after some 10 years of haggling, to something which emerged as the Cairo Declaration, which is essentially the Islamic human rights statement in 1990. Now, there are considerable areas of overlap between that Cairo Declaration and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it has quite a different feel from the latter. Notably in its repeated insistence on the centrality of Islamic law, the Sharia. Here are just a few examples relevant to the policy choices of developing countries. Article 19 states that neither crimes nor punishments are recognized except those provided in the Sharia. Article 22 says that opinions may be expressed freely, provided they are not contrary to the principles of the Sharia. And Articles 24 and 25 make Sharia the only source of reference or clarification of all the rights and freedoms stipulated. On one issue, the Declaration states the precise opposite of the Universal Declaration, which enshrines the freedom of religion and the individual rights to change it. The Islamic Declaration states that Muslims are expressly forbidden to convert to another religion or to become atheists. As some of you may know, Islam punishes apostasy with death, a punishment Sudan stated just recently it attempts to apply to a woman born of a Christian mother who supposedly thereby converted from Islam. I know that this is not the most significant issue in a development context, but it is one that does set the tone for the debate. Unequal treatment is not only the fate of Muslims and non-Muslims. States that give an important place to Islamic law also treat men and women unequally. There are many rules of our daily behavior that place women under the supervision of husbands or elder brothers. Other rules forbid women to engage in certain activities. The Saudi law prohibiting women from driving has been much commented upon and is increasingly challenged in that country. In Iran, according to Amnesty International, women have fewer or lesser rights than men in many areas, around questions of marriage, divorce, child custody or inheritance, and in relation to criminal harm suffered by women, which is less heavily punished than that suffered by men. One of the most discriminating rules under both Sunni and Sharia law, under both Sunni and Shia law, is that which states that in an Islamic court of law, a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man's, thereby contradicting the principle of equality before the law that has been accepted in non-Islamic societies for generations, and which is also a central pillar of development policy. It is, incidentally, clearly an embarrassment to less conservative Islamic thinkers. Now, Muslim women today may place this inequality in perspective by recalling, rightly, that in the Prophet's time, women had no rights at all. They were given limited rights by Muhammad. Still, what was progressive in the first millennium is hardly so in the 21st century. And Islamic thought has hardly evolved from those early views, largely because of its insistence that those views are valid for all times and all places. Now, in addition to this unequal treatment of Muslims and non-Muslims and men and women, there are other specifically Islamic orientations strongly pushed by the fundamentalists that will influence the developmental stance of Islamic states. Under Islamic law, it is unacceptable that a Muslim be politically subordinated to a non-believer. Making a northern Nigerian Islamic leader argue at the end of the 1980s when the president wanted to institute a two-party system that there could only be a Muslim and a Christian party. Other Islamic rules pushed by fundamentalists lead to the denial of the freedom of religion and of expression, the liberal prescription of the death penalty, and the widespread use of so-called inhuman and humiliating punishments. As for these, in the last 20 years or so, a number of Islamic countries, among them Saudi Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan, Somalia, northern Nigeria, and most recently Brunei, have revived ancient Islamic penalties such as crucifixion, stoning, amputation of limbs, and forcible blinding for so-called offences against God. Had crimes, as they're called, with the justification that so-called human rights have to give way to divine rights. Now, what about the views that underline these positions, be they called mainstream or fundamentalist? Mafdudi is one of the most systematic and influential 20th century writers on Islam. For Mafdudi, God is sovereign, not the people, and the law is laid down by God through his prophet. That defines the essential characteristics of an Islamic state. Where an explicit command of God or his prophet already exists, no Muslim leader or legislature can form an independent judgment. An Islamic state is universal and all-embracing. Its sphere of activity is coexistence with the whole of human life. Non-Muslims will not be allowed to influence the basic policy of this ideological state. Now, other views are even more directly relevant to development. Almost 20 years ago, Sardar noted with approval, incidentally, in the European Journal of Development Research, how Islamic scholars have come to reject development studies because these are materialistic and deny the fact that to be a complete human being, an individual must direct all his or her activities towards the service of God. More recently, by Yunus went even further. I quote, in Islam, personal worship and obedience to the rules of other institutions are two sides of the same coin. One cannot exist without the other. Above all, it means that for a Muslim, not only is a personal devotion to God a requirement, but also an Islamic institutional environment in which to live as a Muslim. And it seems reasonable to me to draw the conclusion that mainstream Islamic piety in and by itself strains towards one of the central characteristics of Islamic fundamentalism, the transformation of the surrounding society into a state that is Islamic. Now, I need to go through the last part rather quickly, because I think we are running out of time, aren't we?
We ought to be 5 or 10 minutes.
5 or 10 minutes. Well, I should not take more than 5 minutes. Let me look for a moment at northern Nigeria, which has been so much in the news in the last few weeks. In northern Nigeria, the Sufi Islamic brotherhoods, who are closer to the grassroots than some of the other fundamentalist organizations, have tried to link up with trade unions and political movements that focused on improving the situation of the poor. And that, one must say, has had a positive effect on social welfare and political consciousness. This incidentally was akin to what happened in many other poor countries where during the years of structural adjustment, Islamic institutions have played a significant role in helping to shield the poor from the worst effects of the withdrawal of the state. So these kind of positive things that you have to keep in mind, particularly as I have been not so positive in other respects. Now, this business about Islamic northern Nigeria, which we've heard so much about, the seclusion of married women among the household there is fully accepted. And that you have to know also by the women themselves. Most girls there get married between the ages of 9 and 12, because at the later age they are no longer considered a good match. And this has had major effects upon girls' education, because once married, girls no longer go to school. Many people there are suspicious of the secular school system instituted after independence. They see it as Western and contrary to proper education, which is Quranic, just as they disapprove of modern occupations for women. In response at that time, an adult education program for married or secluded women was started, which was presented as religious education. And that indeed did have positive effects. On the one hand, calling it religious education made it easier for the women to get their husband's assent, which is required. On the other hand, it did enable women to question some of the assertions of their husbands that this or that action or demand had to be accepted because it comes from the Quran. And it also led to literacy, first in Arabic to read the Quran, and eventually also in the local language. But those existing limitations on education are not enough for the extreme and extremist fundamentalists of Boko Haram, who want to impose a strictly Islamic state ruled by the Sharia. Now, we've heard a great deal about them in recent times. Their name means Western education is sinful, and one of the main objectives is to eliminate such Western education. The government of Nigeria has on and off attempted to halt their activities, but troops have often used wholly counterproductive extreme violence and brutality, which in turn has encouraged more people to join the group. One source recently, in the last week or so, suggested that there are now some 30,000 of them. And we've heard much about their latest exploit, which happened only a matter of weeks ago, when they abducted well over 200 schoolgirls from a boarding school, announcing that they'd force them into marriage or sell them into slavery. But they terrorize in other ways too, destroying whole villages and killing their non-fundamentalist inhabitants. And all this is done in the name of Islam. Even so, while Islam is manifestly antagonistic to the equality of women, Muslim women are increasingly challenging that inequality from within Islam. This has been well documented for Europe, as shown by various authors to whom I've referred in my book, Assertive Religion. But it is equally true in Africa. Whatever the formal rules, women do find new ways around the restrictions of Islam. Even though their margin of freedom remains limited, many of them no longer passively accept their reality as a cultural given and reinterpret their situation, often by referring to texts from the Quran different from those held up by authoritarian husbands or mullahs. Our very brief conclusion, in the recent breast beating about Boko Haram, we have heard again and again that all would have been well if only more resources had been channeled to that part of Nigeria, if there had been more development there. No doubt Piketty would have something to say about the neglect of northern Nigeria. But a revolt against that neglect did not have to take the form of extremist fundamentalism, though arguably in northern Nigeria this is an easily available option in terms of the existing culture. So, on the issue of fundamentalism arising as a result of the lack of development, the jury is, in my view, still out. It is clear, on the contrary, that there are certain brands of fundamentalism that seriously inhibit development as we now define it. Maybe not all fundamentalisms. Remember the ambiguous conclusions about Pentecostal fundamentalists. Even so, I'd argue that overall, fundamentalism has little to commend itself from the point of view of development. The issues facing those having to make decisions about development policy are not made any clearer by people of whatever background who really do believe that through their direct line to God, they can come to unambiguous political conclusions. Smilder's remark on the role of Pentecostals in Venezuela is worth repeating here. Pentecostals support evangelical candidates because they are seen as people who, quote, through the schema of spiritual communion, know the truth. It is not that they hold particular political views, nor that they stand for certain kind of policies. It is simply that their God-given certainties are shared by their equally fervent co-religionists. Such certainties also determine the views of Islamists. For all their undoubtedly good intentions, true believers are dangerous to political processes, including those that might help diminish poverty, inequality and exclusion. For them there are no uncertainties, the answers are given and known. End of argument. The correct answers have been provided by God. For those of us who even struggle with finding the right questions, such God-given certainties about the answers are really less than helpful.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for giving us a great deal. Thank you very much for giving us a great deal to think about and to discuss. I'm going to suggest that we have just 2 minutes or so if you talk to your neighbor and see where you can focus, where you agreed, where you disagreed or whatever, and then we'll have the usual questions, and we've got about 25 minutes for people. Have a chance to ask Emmanuel or make a point. So can I have hands up, please? And I'm going to take three questions. We'll take those three. Can the guy in the middle to start with?
Thank you very much, Manuel. That was very nice and informative. I was wondering just a couple of points that I thought it might be in the paper of the book. Firstly, it's I'm from Pakistan, and just my knowledge of sort of religious practice is limited to Pakistan.
Could you speak up a little?
I'm from Pakistan, and my knowledge of religious practice, at least, is limited to that country. But there's a lot of one thing that you missed out, perhaps, in your talk is Sufism and the role that it plays in majority, in the lives of majority of the people, and the fact that most Muslims in India and Pakistan are Barelvis, so followers of Sufism. And the distinction perhaps that you don't make is between Wahhabism and Sufism and other strands and there are multiple sects in Islam. And linked to that is the fact that most of these developments are sort of post-oil discovery and then post-oil kind of richness of Saudi Arabia, etc. And which strengthens Wahhabism a lot. And one of, I guess, the push or the pull factor, whichever you might call it, has been specifically in Pakistan is a flow of Wahhabi money into what are fundamentalists, what you call fundamentalists. Thank you.
Right, the person in front and then the lady behind.
Thanks for your speech. I find a few things in your speech a bit very problematic. In the sense of, I find that a lot of it is it tends to be decontextualized, sees things on a very superficial or surface level, and often generalizes. So, for example, in terms of generalization, you seem to speak of fundamentalists, as uniformly always having uncompromising, commits to principles of, for example, in the case of Islam from the first millennium. And for example, this neglects a plethora of positions even within fundamentalist camps. So, for example, Salafis in Egypt right now who are supporting General Sisi, who's obviously just presided over a massive, biggest crackdown on Islamists in maybe modern history. And things seem to be, what you said as what was progressive in the first millennium is not valid anymore. You seem to imply that there has been no progression, for example, in Islamic history since the first millennium, and this neglects massively things like ijtihad, which obviously means to strive for knowledge and whatever, and continual development. So, I mean, during Egyptian, in 19th century Egypt, for example, we used to have Muslim women doctors, Muslim women teachers, Muslim women who owned property, and ironically, they were deprived of these things when the British, who didn't have universal suffrage, came. They were deprived of these things. I mean, what else?
Why don't we leave it there, because the person behind. Thank you.
Can I just say one more?
Do.
Yeah. I mean, even with this, like, you automatically assume that human rights are, you automatically assume that human rights are universal, unchanging, and all that. And you're saying that lots of Muslim states, for example, refused to apply them after the First or Second World War. I mean, the vast majority of Muslim states were under colonial rule. Of course, they did not have a say, as well as non-Muslim states, for that matter, in the Third World, did not have a say in devising these. Things. I mean, and also you used the example of Sudan apostasy law. I mean, to be honest, a daughter of a converted woman being stoned to death for apostasy. I mean, this is a very, very problematic example to use if you're going to use it as some kind of symbol or some kind of indicator. And even statistics was relatively used. I mean, are we to understand that the UAE, for example, with low secondary education, is particularly fundamentalist? Dubai is particularly fundamentalist. Even Saudi Arabia, which has interest banking and rules in the name of Islam, are these particularly fundamentalist? So I think you're just vaguely generalizing.
Overgeneralizing.
Yeah.
Can we? I think we have to move on. There's much for Emmanuel to come back on.
Professor, thank you very much for the speech. I have a question about, you said your early work was on liberation theology, and I know it falls outside of your definition of fundamentalism, but I would just like to know if you have a view, given in hindsight, what your view is on the impacts of liberation theology on Latin American societies, because it was often seen as kind of a failure in terms of bringing converts, and the real successful religion has been evangelism, which, as you said, is some people have named neoliberalism. But on the other hand, in the last 10 years, in the last 15 years, there has been a very, even though evangelism at the household, at the personal level, has been very successful and is entrenched, but politically, the societies have moved very much against neoliberalism, and in some ways implicitly, or accidentally at least, reivindicating some of the values of liberation theology. Right, so I would like, the question is,
okay. I think we got the question. Okay. Emmanuel, give us the first view, because I'm sure a lot of this is going to continue.
Well, I'm not surprised at the being told that I will generalize and that I simplify. You're absolutely right. If one makes a presentation like this, one of the things you want to do is provoke.
So you have
to simplify,
and you have
to generalize.
On the other hand,
let me pick up the other point that Islam has changed over time. Of course you're right about that too.
But the
central point,
the
central issue which I tried to get across was
the conception,
the self-conception of Islam, which is shared by mainstream Islam
of
any
variety.
And there are many varieties of that. You're absolutely right. And fundamentalist Islam is that Islam is the one and true and only religion.
Now,
if I can get that point across
as
a central issue,
in order to get
it across, you have to simplify and generalize. Again, I do agree with you that I did that.
And I
certainly agree with you that over time
there have been
important changes in many aspects of Islam.
I do
refer to some of those in the printed version, which you can read,
which I hope
is less simplifying and less generalizing.
But the one
thing, if I may pick out one particular issue there, the one thing that does not exist, in spite of all the different versions that exist of Islam, where different theologians talk about different things, what we do not have is an institutionalized version of progressive Islam.
We do have
there are many important, interesting, progressive Islamic thinkers
who will
argue that Islam needs to get away from the literal interpretation which it still sticks to, etc.
Many of those
people have written extremely interesting things,
and there are
Islamic imams too who will make that point.
But they have
not got together
into what
you might call a progressive Islamic movement,
which actually
is willing to stand up
to those
aspects of mainstream Islam which are causing the sorts of problems that I've mentioned.
So
let me leave it at that for now.
Comment on the liberation theology.
There was also the issue of my Sudan example issue raised. Why did I raise that?
Well, I read it last week. It may be that you don't
regard it as important that there is a state which takes that view.
It's there. And it's not
the only one. I mean, one could have found quite a number of other examples which we know about of the last say year or so, in which these old-fashioned punishments have been applied.
So
one takes one example, and then you say, well, why did you take that? I took it because it happened last week.
And if it happened
last week, or maybe it was even this week, I think it's worth pointing out that these things are still happening.
Liberation
theology.
Now,
I wasn't totally clear about what particularly, what the point was. Liberation theology was an extremely important movement in the Catholic Church
in the
1960s. That time.
It is not.
Liberation theology is, if you want, the opposite of the fundamentalist movement, almost.
Because it
argued that
you should use Catholic theology in order to help people to get out of their oppression. It was very significant. It wasn't greatly supported by the hierarchy in general, if I remember it correctly. It was one of those things that one you know. I knew quite a number of those liberation theology priests in Brazil at the time. They were very how should I put it? Brave people in what they did, especially after the military coup in Brazil. And they stood up and they helped the poor. And they believed they used their Catholicism in order to provide a progressive view. So that's in terms of development, that was of course very important. But as I was talking not about that, which is if you want the opposite of fundamentalism, I haven't really mentioned it.
Can we take some 3 questions on this side? Yes, there's one. Anyone else? The microphone is coming a second, and then a third. So I'm sticking to this side of the room. Okay, then we'll take the third yourself. Right.
By defining fundamentalism as lack of development, and religion in general, as fundamentalism in particular, as some sort of answer to uncertainties that derive from the lack of development. Don't you think that, or as opposed to, as Boko Haram literally means, to the Western education, don't you think that the rise of these new fundamentalist groups, movements in places where it didn't have such a big power before might be related to the lack of a counter player on an ideological way in the political realm, in development in general? So the whole sort of aid material and ideology that followed some sort of counter ideology coming from the communist era that is no longer in the development arena. Do you think has played a role in this sort of providing answers for uncertainties, leaving room for more fundamentalism in religion? Thank you.
My question is on the Christian side of fundamentalism and the Pentecostal movement. From my own experience in Brazil, I see that eventually those groups, they have, I would say, in terms of development, a beneficial contribution, especially when you're talking about very poor communities in urban settings, where I mean, not only they provide education, but especially when we're talking about authority and source of social organization. I mean, just maybe if you can comment on that.
And why don't I give you this microphone?
Shall we?
Yeah, well, use that.
I just was kind of, I'm not sure if I misunderstood this, but from what I could tell, your issue with religious fundamentalism was with this idea that, well, one of the issues was with the idea of one true kind of religion. And I was wondering, outside of religion, people often have views that they believe in wholeheartedly. And would you project that this kind of absolutism with regards to any social issue as impeding development, or just with regards to religion?
Sorry. Could you just rephrase that a little bit?
Yeah. So in the talk you were saying about how religion particularly like Islam and Christianity, they believe in their religion being the one true way of connecting with divine.
You are asking are there secular views which also believe they have the true way?
That have the true answers. Right. Would you believe that they would also impede developing countries in the same way as religion?
Yeah.
You want to answer?
No, Melissa wants to make a comment in this.
It was actually a very similar question to the last two, Emmanuel. I missed the beginning of your talk, but I was interested in how, where you ended up with the problems of religious fundamentalism in relation to an inherently uncertain and, one might say, contested world, where there are multiple views of what development, if one defines it broadly as progressive change, might be. So my question, it's a little bit like this question, would be, would you put other kinds of, is the problem religious fundamentalism, or is it fundamentalism in general, in which one might put certain forms of market fundamentalism, one might put neoliberal ideologies, one might put certain forms of state authoritarianism and ideology?
Well, let me take this the last point first. I think that's very interesting. I remember once, a few years ago, reading a book about fundamentalism, which precisely went down that road and said fundamentalism is not just a question of religion. You have fundamentalism in economics, you have fundamentalism. That's absolutely right. I mean, it's absolutely right in one sense. It transposes into those other areas a set of concepts which really were developed originally in a religious context. And I tend to be slightly uneasy when we use a word like fundamentalism so widely. But on the other hand, it does help us see that you have such extreme. Is it fundamentalist or what? But that such extreme views, like the views of religious fundamentalists, also exists in other areas. And sorry? Dogmatism, certainty. We know, etc. Of course, that is right, and that helps. And there is a neoliberal fundamentalism, if you want, which at the IDS we're all familiar with. So I mean, basically, the answer to this question about the non-religious fundamentalists. And does that possibly, in certain respects, have a similar effect on development as religious fundamentalism? I mean, my answer would be, if you want to use that word, yes. It's quite clear that there are analogies, and that it is in a sense helpful to use what we have learned from the religious side in those other non-religious areas and come to, if you want, very similar conclusions. So that I think answers basically gives a positive answer to those two questions. The lack of a counterplay as was put. I think it is absolutely right that the falling away of Marxism as a serious, or what was considered a serious alternative to the more general and more accepted Western approaches to economy and society. The falling away of that as a believable approach has given others the opportunity to step in.
I think actually what this brings out, if you look back 20 or 30 years, and you realize that these religious fundamentalisms were probably rather less important, certainly in developing countries, and in the whole argument about development than they are now. At that time, we had the other kind of fundamentalism, which was the Marxist fundamentalism, which was still around. In a sense, links up again with the same question about non-religious fundamentalism. So the disappearance of that, if you want, of the Marxist counterplayer to the non-Marxist approach has given these religious counterplayers greater strength. And I think I even made that point in some part, somewhere in the book, if I'm not mistaken. But yes, it is an important and certainly relevant point. On Brazil and the Pentecostals there, yes, I mean the point that you make, that they have, particularly in urban areas, had certain positive effects that follows, if you want. That is similar to what I said about the Pentecostals when I talked about them in Chile. There are certain positive effects which they have, although what is interesting, I mean, it is positive from a personal point of view, about how they experience reality. It is not so clear, and I used to know Brazil very well, but I can't talk about it anymore in the same way, so I don't really know much about the Brazilian Pentecostals, but what appears to be the case of people who have looked at this in a wider context, not only Brazil, not only Chile, but in general, is that it has a positive effect on people's personal lives, but it does not seem to have what I call the Weberian effect, in terms of actually enabling people to move up in the world in a significant way as a group. That seems, on the whole, not to have happened. Now, I stand to be corrected in terms of Brazil. If it has happened there, I don't know. But a study which looked at a number of countries suggested that this was not the case.
I think we ought to say at this point thank you to Emmanuel for very stimulating, very provocative, much to think about. If you've got a final, there's two or three, let's take two or three quick questions and quick replies.
Yes and no.
Because we're reaching the half-hour limit. Perhaps the microphone is no longer working. That may be that it's got a... Why don't you talk up quickly?
So I was wondering, we spoke about this randomly in a seminar about the interconnection of international influence, especially regarding fundamentalism, and more or less the instrumentalization of religion sometimes in a broader political context. For example, like this whole effect of 9/11, and for example, Boko Haram, I think, was very active after this incident. And how far would you see this in this part of this interconnection with international interests regarding religion?
Okay, that's a nice, specific, narrow question. Final question.
I'll try to be brief and narrow too. I'll try. So you've been so provocative. So first of all, I think with the Muslim faith and with Islam, I think one of the crises we face is a crisis of representation. Because as with one of the examples you gave with the Roman Catholic Church, you know how they were extremist or fundamentalist movements or not, but the church was able to, as an institution, say no to them. I think we've had this challenge of crisis of representation since after the World War, when it was dismantled. And of course what that's meant is that representation is legitimized by what Western media or academics make mainstream. And if you look at the pockets of fundamentalism that do exist in the Islamic world, because remember we're talking about 1.6 billion people, if they were all fundamentalists, mainstream fundamentalism, then I think this would be a very different situation right now. So what happens is that the people who are actually not religious authorities become representatives of a religion of 1.6 billion people. And looking at that in the context of, for instance, the push and pull factors that you were talking about towards fundamentalism, and building on Michelle's question, don't you think it's important to look at the political impact of various events, if not even of 9/11? Go back a little bit further to the end of the First World War, when the entire Middle East was carved up, and the way it was socially engineered, with different minorities given more power, which has obviously led to conflicts within Islam, within sects which never existed before. So I think there's a huge chunk of history. I mean, we have a short-term memory for a lot of these things. Another last one, sorry, brief. Do you think it's valuable to maybe look at the nuances between patriarchal cultures and Islam? Because a lot of the examples that you've actually given, I mean, if we discuss this more at length, can be reduced to cultural practices and something that Islam doesn't actually allow. I'm not going to sit here and be an apologetic, but I think many of them are very obvious examples. And again, with Sudan or whatever it might be, the state doesn't actually have religious authority, so that crisis of representation really comes in, and then suddenly it becomes Islam instead of Sudan. So 1.6 billion people.
Okay. Okay.
Patriarchalism and Islam, you're absolutely right again. Again, it's one of those things where I didn't raise it here. In my book, I do discuss that distinction and make it quite clear that you cannot argue that everything is a question of religion. It is also partly a question of patriarchal culture, if you want. So I completely agree with you there. Whether to what extent these outside influences and the way they are represented by the media, as you put it, have made a difference. Well, yes. It's partly also this discussion about instrumentalization. Do issues get picked up and then get enlarged by various forms, particularly through the media? Does that then again have a feedback effect on what happens and what occurs? Yes. Let me only say that one cannot talk about everything, and you have to limit yourself to some things. Some of the overwhelming issues that I did try to present simplified, I think merit looking at and merit consideration. To what extent this is. To what extent these are instrumentalized things or questions which are enlarged by the media, I'm not totally sure. I mean, I would like to remain neutral on that, and a neutral response at the end of a very clear set of issues is perhaps not a bad thing.
Well, thank you very much, Emmanuel. I think of all the Sussex development lectures that I've heard, this is the one that is going to lead to most continuing debate and discussion. I think I praise you for your boldness and provocation. I make, though, a very serious point that part of the reason I think why it's been so provocative is that it's not normally part of discussion of development. Somehow we've excluded this very large and important element. So thank you very much, and I ask people to join us. Come September, I suppose.